This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and thanks all for being here. In particular to Natalia, Alejandra, Paulo for the invitation. As she said, the topic was supposed to be and will be about Latin American constitutionalism, but we decided to focus it more on the early radicals in Latin America. Two disclaimers, one about this, the other is I'm not a historian, I'm a lawyer, and I have a particular interest in political philosophy, although my work has required me to read and to learn some history. Just one minor biographical note. I became interested in the topic because I was interested in present political life in Latin America, and with the intuition or the certainty that we have problems, particularly, different problems coming from different sources, but also institutional problems. So I assume that we have been dismissing the importance of institutional problems for attending present social conflicts, social problems. So all my life I have been working with institutional issues, particularly on constitutional creation, constitutional reforms. Now, when I started working with contemporary reform in Latin America, particularly I was working in the Argentina, it was involved in the discussion of Argentinian constitutional reforms in the 90s, and I decided that I couldn't say what I wanted to say, or that in order to gain more certainty about what I was saying or wanted to say, I need to go back and study history and learn about the sources, in particular of the sources of radicalism in Latin America. So that's why I went to the States and I did my PhD there and working the US Constitution, assuming that the Latin American constitutions had a lot to do with the North American constitutions. I mean, as we will see, the Latin American constitutions also come from different sources, but that has been particularly important. And then, trying to learn about the US constitutions, I came to read more about the early radicalism in the United States. For me, as I will say, part or the essentials of the US constitutions may be explained or can gain, I think, clarity by studying early radicalism in the United States. And also, in order to study US radicalism, I started reading more about the British radicalism. So that has been my trajectory, going back to the early Republican sources here and elsewhere. So that's the origin of the project. So in my presentation today, the main goal is to try to say something about contemporary constitutionalism, but I will start very far back, and as I said, with a particular focus on radicalism. So a few words about early radicalism in the Anglo-American context. I became particularly interested in radicalism because there I saw that there were the first challenges to the representative system, to the political system, and so I mean, just to take a starting point, I came to study British radicalism, and particularly this period that was following the so-called Wilkes crisis in Great Britain, and the coming of the radical dissenters, the Constitutional Society, the Society of Supporters of Bill of Rights, all groups that were very much involved in early discussions about representation and monarchy, so there you get some names and some quotes. One particular figure that has been important in all this trajectory was Thomas Paine, and particularly Thomas Paine discussions with Edmund Burke has been important to understand British radicalism, US radicalism, and Latin American radicalism. Concerning Thomas Paine, which I think is kind of the bridge that puts all this story together. Thomas Paine, as well as you know better than me, was a kind of obscure figure in the public life in England before going to the United States after an invitation by Benjamin Franklin. And in the United States, he became very much involved in the constitutional discussions. I mean, his pamphlet, Common Sense, became enormously popular in the United States because he was vindicating independence, political independence. And in a way, his influence, Thomas Paine's influence in early constitutionalism in the United States, I think, had a great impact in one particular state, but I would say it has an enormous impact generally in order to understand, or will help us a lot, I think, to understand many of the institutions that were then inserted into the American Constitution. So just to make some notes, Thomas Paine got involved particularly in the 1776 Constitution in Pennsylvania. That constitution for me is represent a great moment in early constitutionalism in the United States, and I would say in America. Although it's the constitution of one single state, and you would say a minor state, it actually was a revolution because it includes many ideas that you don't find today in contemporary constitutionalism. That was, I would say, an exemplar constitution, which is, even from our present standard, was very democratic constitution. So I here brought a copy of it, just to read a few things about the constitutions. Of course, I mean, it started with the idea that all men were born equally free and independent and have certain natural, inherent, and inalienable rights. So first it was committed to some principles of self-government that for British radicalism were very important and for Thomas Paine were particularly important. Just one note, Paine was very much influenced by discussion with two British radicals, Richard Price and Joseph Priestley. In a way, both of them, and in the end the three of them, held very serious discussions with Edmund Burke. So particularly here in Great Britain, you see this debate between conservatives and radicals, which is very important. But let's go back to Thomas Paine and the Constitution in Pennsylvania. So that early Constitution inaugurated a period of so-called early radicalism or radical constitutionalism in the United States. So before the crucial constitution, the national constitution of 1787, you have many different state constitutions that differ a lot from what was then put in the national constitution in the 1787 constitution. So the main example of this early radicalism, as I said, was the Pennsylvania Constitution, and it included many, I would say, peculiar institutions from our perspective. One I will give particular attention, which is what for example Morris Beale called the strict separation of powers. And I don't know if you can see from there, but so the idea, which I will now explain, the strict separation of power is just the opposite of what came to be understood as a system of checks and balances. So I want to say something about this strict separation of powers, but let me say something about the philosophy of the Constitution. The idea was that was an early Constitution very much open to the people. So from the perspective of that period, was quite spectacular. The legislative power had to be always open to the people. That was there in the Constitution. Every time that a law was going to be discussed, or a project was going to be discussed in Congress, first it had to be published publicly. Everybody had to have the chance, the people at large had the chance to see what they were going to discuss, and so they had the opportunity to say something before the law was going to be, or the statute was going to be discussed in Congress. Then they included many institutions that were supposed to work for making a strong connection between representatives and the people. So things like the mandatory instructions. So you have the right to instruct your representatives. Then you have the right to recall. So, for example, the representative was not following what he promised, or he promised to do, and so you had the right to recall your representative. Then you have mandatory rotation, for example. So then there was this institution of annual elections, because the idea was if you don't have annual elections, then you have slavery. So all these institutions that then disappear from the national constitutions were very important in this early period. In the handout I distribute, I put some of the institutions, how they circulate in different state constitutions. So, for example, here you have unicameral legislatures. Then I also want to say something about that. In the constitutions of Georgia, Pennsylvania, Vermont, executives that were chosen by the legislature, which were present in 9 of the 18 constitutions, an executive without veto powers, a popular elected council, popular election for candidates to the majority of government positions, a senate that was directly elected by the people, so the right to mandatory rotation, and as I said, in some constitutions, this right to recall representatives and mandatory instructions. So the idea was to have a very strong connection between representatives and the people, so to have many different bridges between the people and the representatives. This was seen as for the federalist dominant political elite, this was seen as we will see, was seen as a problem, because they assumed that a too close connection between the representatives and the people would make the representatives mere mouthpieces, so they will not be able to freely discuss and change their minds. If you go back again to these early discussions in Great Britain, you have this very influential piece by Edmund Burke, so the Bristol discourse, where he was in a way attacking this idea of having a too close connection between the representatives of the people. So that's the famous passage in Edmund Burke writing, saying your representative is a representative of the nation, so it's not the representative of a faction. And so the representative has to have the possibility, the chance to discuss in Parliament. So Parliament, he says, is a Congress of ambassadors, and they have to have the chance to freely discuss and change their minds. And so you don't want your representative to have a close connection. This was a famous debate between Edmund Burke and a representative of the political factions here, named Krager, and he said that no, that you shouldn't allow the representatives to do whatever they want, because then they start working by themselves, for themselves, and not for the people. So that debate was already there in 1774 in Great Britain, and came to the United States, and then will come also to Latin America. So here what we are seeing is there are at least two very important different understanding of the political system, two very different understandings of the institutional creation. And so you have this quote-unquote more democratic understanding, and Paine and the Constitution of 1776 in Pennsylvania is a very good example of that. So the whole idea is more, if you want, Rousseauian idea. So based on the sovereignty of the people, the will of the people, the need to respect the people's will, etc. And so the institutional expression of that democratic or more democratic philosophy was always the creation of very strong legislative power, so strong Congress. So Congress was going to be the representation of the people, and also the idea that the representation was not seen as a desired goal, but just as a necessary evil. So it's a second best option. It's something that you don't want, but there is no alternative to that. So, but this is also an important point because for most peoples, for example, in the United States or in the political elite, what they say is that, well, they were seeing representation as a first option, a desired option, not as a second best. No, as James Madison would say in the famous Federalist Paper number 10, the representatives are going to represent your interests better than you yourself with your group or your allies. So the representation is something that is not just a necessary evil, a second best option, but it's something that we need. So we have these two visions. So as I said, the Pennsylvania Constitution represents this different understanding of constitutionalism, and so again, the core of the institutional system is Congress, no, and the relationship between the people and the political representatives in Congress. That's why the idea of strict separation was important. Strict separation of power. I mean, they all agree, conservatives and radicals, they all agree in the need of separating power, but they had different understanding of how to separate powers and how to play between the different branches of power. So in the system of strict separation of power, the idea is, I mean, I'm not going to assess now, I mean, whether this is good or bad, but just making the point that the point of the strict separation of power was basically to protect Congress, because you know that this is going to be the popular branch, the more numerous branch, and the creation of legislation is there. So if you say that each branch has to restrict itself to its own business, then basically what that meant was don't touch Congress. You have to leave Congress as a strong part of government. The idea of the checks and balances is just the opposite idea. The idea is that Congress is a main source of problem, and so you have to create a system of internal controls, but the main control go to Congress because that's the most dangerous institution. So you will have in the system that was then adopted, in the checks and balances, you have a presidential veto against Congress. You have two branches within the two sections of Congress, or Congress separated into two, but also you have the Senate, which is not just a different, the same people discussing in a different place, but it's people which basically represented at that moment the wealthy people in the country, or the big property owners. So it's a particular strong check to the popular will, if you want. And then you have what will be developed as the system of judicial review. So here you see these two different understanding of the representative system, which again, I think that the Pennsylvania Constitution illustrates very well. So the Pennsylvania Constitution is by far the best example of an early radical constitution in America, which implied, many different institutional tools, mechanisms that you won't find around after the enactment of the 1787 Constitution. But you have this early moment of radicalism, which came together with many different institutions. So before making a transition to Latin America, let me say a few more words about this early period of radicalism. So radicals had a particular institutional model to offer, which you see in many different states in early post-independence, pre-constitutional, in this pre-constitutional period in the United States. So particularly in this period between the independence, 1776 of the United States, and 1785, more or less. So in that period, you see most of the states with the new constitutions, and all these constitutions in one way or another reflect the echoes of the Pennsylvania Constitution. So you have many of these early constitutions with a particular, I would say, interesting alternative institutional project, but these belong to I would say, more complete understanding of politics, a more, if you want, complete, comprehensive understanding or a more comprehensive philosophy, which came together with a particular understanding of men, about human motivation, a particular important role also of the idea of civic virtue, as in many of these early Republican thinkers. So, I mean, Thomas Paine, but also people like Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson would represent these politicians, theoreticians, very much concerned with the idea of civic virtue, because the idea was we need society to be able to stand up and fight for their own rights, as they did in the independence period. So the independence moment, the moment of a Declaration of Independence, is a very particular and very particularly important moment in U.S. history, because, I mean, there was the example of what could be in the future, no? So people mobilize in defense of their interest, but it's also the interest of their country, and so they are ready to stand up and fight and give their own life for the destiny of their country, no? So the independence of the country. So you have this institutional project, which is connected to a certain understanding of human behavior, which went around to this idea of civic virtue. And then you also have an economic understanding, if you want a view about the material basis of society. It's not by chance that, I mean, these early Republican thinkers like Thomas Paine or Thomas Jefferson wrote very important work on, for example, the Agrarian Republic, or in the case of Paine, agrarian justice, or if you know the idea of 40 acres and a mule. So the idea is we can all live with some basic material basis which will allow us to live as independent beings. And so at the same time we will have our interests will be common with the interests of all the other all the other citizens. So that, I mean, I will not go into that, but there are all these fantastic, discussions about what economic model to follow, and so in that particular period in the U.S. history, you see these discussions about, well, where should we go in economic terms, and many of these early Republicans, they say, well, the choice between, say, a commercial life or an agrarian society, I mean, should depend on what kind of citizens we want. And so, if you create a commercial society, then you will have. I'm not saying that they were right or wrong. I'm just saying what many of them they were saying. That if you develop a commercial society, what you will have is people fighting each other, not recognizing the others as equals. They will see each of the others as competitors, and so they will start fighting each other. And so we don't want that. We want a society so organized in small communities with people having enough to live and to become independent. And so also they will share certain basic interests. So the discussion was not just a discussion about what economic model, say, will produce more money or more richness to the country, but instead, I mean, what kind of citizen we want. So that discussion was not a minor discussion. There is this book I like very much by a contemporary political philosopher, Michael Sandel. The book is called Democracy's Discontent, and he, in a way, goes back to these early discussions trying to retrieve that old Republican model. And as you may know, better than I know, there is all this very important movement within contemporary historians which try to reconstruct the US history in line with the political philosophy of republicanism. So you have all these wonderful historians like John Pocock or Bernard Bailey, or my favorite, which is Gordon Wood. So these spectacular historians doing this work of trying to retrieve the traces of republicanism in early constitutional discussions, in this framing period. So there, I said something about this alternative institutional model, and why I think it's important and why I put so much attention. Well, first because I find that there is something attractive there, but also, as I anticipate, I think that this radicalism has a strong explanatory capacity, so will help us understand why the different institutions, how to explain many of the or most of the different institutions that were then incorporated in the 1787 Constitution. I think, and this I think is a plausible reading of US constitutional history, that the national constitution, so the 1787 Constitution, is in a very important part a response to that early period of radicalism. And if you read, all the books of the time, and particularly the constitutional debates, or best of the best, the Federalist Papers, you see that they were all the time, particularly Madison and Hamilton, and particularly Madison, all the time discussing with the radical adversaries, the Republican adversaries. So the whole idea, that organizes the Federalist Paper, which is the idea of factions, is in a way, Madison trying to challenge these early radical movements. As Gordon Wood put it, they were very much concerned about some of these early armed rebellions that were in 1785. There was an economic crisis, and so they were in many different states. For example, in Rhode Island, you have these military rebellions or popular rebellions. So the most famous of all was the so-called Shays Rebellion. But most of all, they fear what some of these early legislatures were doing. And particularly the worst example or the best example was the Pennsylvania and Rhode Island legislatures. Why? Because they say this, in this situation, Congress does whatever the people want, and so it's pure populism. And so, that was the period of, and this is the last thing I say about US early history, but this period, around 1785, remember the Constitution comes 2 years later, but so 1785 is the time of the so-called the crisis of paper money, the paper money crisis. So it's a profound economic crisis, and in order to go out, find a solution to this crisis, many of these early legislators, what they start doing is, following what the people demand, which was the emission of paper money. So that's the only way, to solve the economic crisis and the situation of a majority of debtors. So what you need to do is, emission of money. And so this created this paper money crisis. But for the political elite of the time, for the Federalists, this was the chaos. So they say, we were fighting against those armed rebellions, and everybody agreed that that is something that we don't want. But then we find that these people in Congress are doing exactly the same that these other people with guns were doing in the street. So, and this is much worse, because now it comes with the authority of law, and that's what we don't want. So we need to prevent this to happen again. So we don't want this to happen at the national level. So we need to create a different institutional system. So the worst thing that could happen is to have at the national level something like the Pennsylvania Constitution. It's clear? What is it? You understand? So the whole idea was, we don't want at the national level something like the Pennsylvania Constitution. So that's my reading, my understanding of early American constitutional history. Is debatable, of course, but I think that there is lots of ways to support what I'm saying, and I wouldn't say it's a big dispute about the influence of these early radical constitutions and the paper money crisis. So in the end, what we have is two different opposite institutional models that had also to do with a different understanding of politics, a different political philosophy. So let's move now to Latin America. As I said, Spain is going to be of help. The writings of Thomas Paine came to Latin America through a book that was translated by a Venezuelan character, García de la Serna, and he published this book about La Independencia de la Costa Firme according to Thomas Paine. So he published this book, which included many papers by Thomas Paine, and also some reference to the early American constitutions, and also reference to Thomas Jefferson writings. And this book was influential in Latin America. So you see this thread. I mean, for example, Artigas read that book, even or some people read these two Artigas, but it's clear that Artigas was aware. Artigas is one of the early radical revolutionaries in Latin America, no? But so there is this continuation between what had happened in all the Britain and what came to happen in the United States and what then happened in Latin America. But different sources, I mean, so as I said, I mean, the writings of Thomas Jefferson were known, the Declaration of Independence was known, some of these debates were known in Latin America. Now, of course, the situation of radicalism in Latin America is completely different, and as I will say, you don't have radical groups having a strong influence in the Constitutional Convention. In the United States, you have some representatives that push for more radical democratic ideas, even at the level of the Constitutional Convention, and particularly at the time of ratifying the Constitution. So the discussion about radicalism and the challenges coming from radical figures, politicians, was extremely important in the United States. I would say was less influential, but was important in Latin America. About Latin America, I would say that there are two crucial moments in the 19th century in order to follow the history of radical ideas. One is the 1810, so the moment of, as in the United States, the moment of independence is particularly important. That's a moment where politicians read and promoted radical papers, radical pamphlets. So, for example, the writings by Rousseau were also popular in many different countries. And then the second crucial moment, so one is 1810, and the other would come by the mid-19th century, and I would say following the so-called democratic revolutions in Europe, in the 1848 revolutions in Europe, that would also create or promote a wave of radicalism in Latin America. Now, as I said, in the United States you have radicals who were actually drafting constitutions, at least at the state level. It's different, as I said, the influence of radicals in the national constitutions. They had an impact, but was less important. In Latin America, that situation you don't have. But so in order to say what was there, what was not, I mean, I should clarify more what I understand by radicalism, but I have been trying to define it through different features of this of what these radicals promoted, or what everybody agreed that were radicals, what they were promoting. But basically, again, I mean, there is this commitment to the so-called the will of the people, the idea of the sovereignty of the people, and that idea as the organizing idea within the institutional framework. So how to create an institutional, so for radicals the idea was how to create an institutional framework that honors the will of the people. So even though, I mean, still today we have different difficulties to understand how to do that, but that's the idea. So that's what we want to achieve. I mean, as far as we can. So let me start with one quote by which you also have in your handout. So in the other side of the page, by Simon Bolivar. I think I find this quote very telling. Is Bolivar talking about the early, one of the earliest the earliest constitutions in Latin America, which is the 1811 Constitution. The Constitution basically, I mean, did not came into force, but for Bolivar, that Constitution represented a disaster. I mean, it was represented the worst possible world, because did just the contrary of what he was pushing for, which was the concentration of power, the centralization of authority, the centralization of power. So even though the Constitution was not actually in power, in force, he said in his memorial to the citizens of New Granada in 1813, among the causes that brought about Venezuela's downfall, the nature of its constitutions ranks first, which I repeat was as contrary to Venezuela's interests as it was favorable to those of their adversaries. So he put a lot of the blame, I mean the blame in the constitution, in this basically an existent constitution, but say this is what we don't want. And so in what sense, I mean, what was this constitution doing? Well, first, nobody would characterize this as a radical constitution, but it included some of the concerns of these early radicals, which was a particular concern with having a strong executive. I mean, they were coming from a situation of monarchy, of tyranny, of caudillism, and they didn't want that reproduced in the new independent country. So what this constitution do, for example, and this was what got Bolivar crazy, is that it created an executive power with three heads. Basically, the idea was we don't want you, Bolivar, I mean, as a head of power. I mean, so we are afraid of you. So this happened in the early constitution in Venezuela, and also will happen in other early constitutions in Latin America, for example, in the Peruvian constitution of 1823. So this idea of we are so afraid of the concentration of power, we are so afraid of people like Bolivar in terms of, I mean, them becoming a dictator or a quasi-dictator, that we want to prevent that, I mean, in the constitution. And so what we're going to do is to weaken the executive power. So that for Bolivar was the worst of all possible alternatives. So just a clarification about that, because you may know Bolivar was known and is still known as the great revolutionary leader in Latin America, but also, I mean, he was a quite conservative constitutional thinker, and of course, I mean, for good or bad reasons. So what he wanted was a concentration of power. The idea was the only way to fight, I mean, to ensure the independence of these new nations was to have the concentration of powers in the hands of a small elite, a small group. So you cannot allow the dispersion of power. You cannot talk about democracy at this moment. So later on, I mean, this great constitutional thinker, Argentinian constitutional thinker Alberto, would say, well, I mean, we had all these old constitutions like the Bolivarian constitutions, and I think they were right. I mean, this is not what we were doing, what we are going to do today, what we're going to do now, but at that time, Alberti said, I mean, that was rational to do. So the concentration of power. So those constitutions, I mean, where Bolivar took part, and Bolivar was very much involved in constitutional creation. He said, I mean, people like Alberti, a liberal conservative, he said, this is what was required at that time. No? So the concentration of authority. Facts like the coming of these constitutions that were not and cannot be considered radical constitutions, but in a way where they were reacting against the concentration of power. I mean, in that way, you see some of the traces of this early radical thinking in Latin America. Just a few more events, and then I start concluding. But I need to say a few more things. One is another crucial event in early Latin America. So one was, as I said, these early constitutions like the Venezuelan Constitution of 1811. There is probably the best example of a radical constitution, perhaps the only actual example of a radical constitution in Latin America, which is the 1814 constitution in Mexico, the Apatzingán Constitution, which was written by the radical priest, Morelos. So those were, very minor, non-existent constitutions, but they were written, they were celebrated at one point, and they have some influence. So these early, traces of constitutionalism or radical constitutionalism in a way, they had some impact in early Latin American history. Other events, like for example the revolution in Haiti, that's also important in order to explain a lot of what happened in the coming years. As you know, there was in the end of the 17th century was a very bloody revolution in Haiti, and that created panic among many of these early political leaders, the same like Bolivar. So they said what happened in Haiti was Jacobinism. That was an illustration of what could do Jacobinism in Latin America. So that's what we don't want. So there was these early examples that created panic in the political elite, and so I think these early facts help to explain the conservadurism or the conservadurization of constitutionalism in the first half of the 19th century. And a few words about which is more important, what happened in the mid-19th century, the coming of the radical revolutions or the democratic revolutions in Europe. They also have impact in Latin America. At least 3 countries you find artisan groups trying to reproduce what had happened in Europe. There were strong contacts between Latin America and Europe, and so particularly in Chile, Colombia, and Peru, you have this artisan mobilization demanding for an expansion of political rights, and that created a second wave of radicalism in Latin America. How was this translated into an institutional model? As I said, you don't have the example of a radical constitution. You don't have a national constitution that clearly responds to what radicals demand, but the radical ideas were, in a way, the specter of radicalism was there, and so many of the political leaders were fighting against that possibility. In particular, this recreation of radicalism in the mid-19th century, I think provoke that would be my reading of early Latin American constitutional history, which here it happened something like what had happened before in the United States, which is that these early radical constitutions force a response, which is the national constitution, the enactment, the draft of the national constitution of 1787, that, as I said, responded in part or can be understood as a response to the early radical constitutions. And I think that what happens in Latin America in the second half of the 19th century is in many ways a response to this period of radicalization. So this is one of the last few notes of Latin American history. Here happens probably the most important event one of the two most important events in Latin American constitutional history, which is you find in almost all countries the celebration of a compact between liberals and conservatives. And of course, this is an event that requires explanation because during decades, liberals and conservatives were killing each other. So we're fighting against each other. And suddenly, in all countries, they start sitting in the same table to negotiate a constitution. That may be explained by different reasons, but one important reason is the radicalization that followed the democratic revolutions in Europe, which forced liberals and conservatives to get together and try to find a way out to this problem. So for the first time you have in the same table not a liberal constitution, a conservative constitution, that was the typical thing in Latin America. So the whole first half of the 19th century you have either conservative constitutions or liberal constitutions. The conservative constitution in Chile, 1833, for example, the Huancayo constitution in Peru. So all these very extreme examples of conservatism or liberalism. But now you start having, these liberal conservative constitutions. So, for example, in Argentina, you find that liberals and conservatives sit together and write the 1853 constitution. In Mexico, liberals and conservatives sit together and write the 1857 constitution. In Colombia, you have that these very liberal constitutions that were present at the mid-19th century start getting more conservative by the end of the century. And in Chile, you have the reverse process, where a very conservative constitution like the 1833 constitution becomes more and more liberal by the end of the century. So in different countries, in different ways, you start getting these constitutions that reflect a compact between liberals and conservatives. And that, I think, is there you have established the basic framework of Latin American constitutionalism. That's the main framework that's still today present, distinguishing our constitutions. So constitutions that were in part a reaction to the risk of majoritarian participation, constitutions that give additional powers to the president. So, for example, you have this, the liberals promoted something like the US system of checks and balances, and conservatives wanted a more concentrated authority. So when you have these compacts, you have this mixture between checks and balance, the liberal US project, and the conservative project of concentrating authority. So you have constitutions, as most constitutions still today in Latin America, where you have a system of checks and balance which is actually unbalanced in favor of the executive. So, that's a clear product of the liberal conservative compact. So you have checks and balances as, liberals wanted, but, distorted by what conservatives demanded was the concentration of power. So you have a checks and balance with an executive power which is which gains additional power. So in that sense, so here I'm getting close to the end. You start seeing that also in Latin America in different ways, but you see that the national constitutions and those constitutions that were drafted at that time were enormously important to understand present Latin American constitutionalism. So those constitutions are in part, again, as in the United States story, a response to the risk of the radicalization of society. So many of the institutions that were then created also respond to that fear of the radicalization of society. So even though radicals were not present in the Constitutional Convention and did not manage to draft a constitution, although they were projects, there were these fabulous, for example, project by Francisco Bilbao, the Chilean. He wrote a whole project under the model of the Jacobin Constitution, the French Constitution of 1795. He said that's the only real constitution in the history of the world. We have to go to the Jacobin Constitution. So you have these projects written by by these early radicals, but you don't have a radical constitution. You have, again, constitution responding to the demand of, reacting against what radicals were demanding. Final notes, and conclusion, if you want. For me, it was interesting to understand what radicals were demanding at that time for many different reasons. One was, in order to understand why some of these institutions were chosen in the new constitution. You get some explanation for why they chose certain institutions, say the concentration of power, why they rejected many institutional alternatives like rotation, mandatory instructions, etc., etc. And also it's interesting to see what were the demands of radicals at that time compared to what, and that will be the only note I make about the 20th century, but I will be happy to discuss more about the 20th century, but it's interesting to compare what radicals were consistently demanding all during the 19th century in Latin America and what they demand today. Of course, here we have the problem of concepts, how to define radicalism, but radicals, in Latin America, 19th century, they were basically, I would characterize them by two main claims, or three. One is their anti-presidentialist drive. They were very much and consistently against the concentration of authority in the executive. And also, they all stress the importance of the so-called social question. Basically, expansion of political rights, but then the problem how to solve these inequalities. But if you see the writings, that's my impression. If you see the writings, the pamphlets, they were not using the language of rights. That was a language of liberalism. They were fighting for social justice, for equality, against the injustice in society. But then you get this that of course I'm synthesizing what they were thinking, but in terms of constitutional creation, I think these two ideas were extremely important. So one is anti-presidentialism, and the other is doing something for the so-called social question. So in the 19th century. And then when you get to the 20th century, you see many radical groups which fight for the concentration of powers in the executive, so strong presidents and social rights. So, when you see, of course there are lots of things to say before getting to this, but I'm just anticipating because I think it's an interesting point, which when you see the new constitutions in Latin America, and new I'm meaning the 20th century constitution from the Mexican 1917 constitution to the Venezuelan or the Bolivian constitution of the 2009, 2008 in Ecuador, or 1999 in Venezuela, you have constitutions that are called or are seen as radical constitutions, or this is an expression of the new radicalism in Latin America, and you have constitutions that create a very strong presidential authority, and they try to solve the social problem through the idea of rights, which, the old radicals would say, we were not talking about, about social rights. And that's not just a linguistic point, because the whole idea of rights is, when you include rights in the Constitution, you make a call to judges, and you individualize a social problem. So you make it one by one. And so it's a kind of a important question, what you do regarding the social question. So I have not been talking about the 20th century, 21st century, but I just want to raise that point, that is, that what the radicals were doing at that point, and they were doing that consistently across countries and during the 19th century. You may find one exception here or there, but that was, I would say, the crucial understanding when you read Murillo Toro in Colombia, Francisco Bilbao in Chile, Santiago Arcos in Chile, perhaps Dorrego in Argentina, perhaps Artigas also. You see a different understanding of constitutional problems. So I will basically leave there. So the idea was, to read the development of constitutionalism through the lens of radicalism, and I think that that particular perspective, is quite helpful to understand what happened in the United States, why the Constitution got the shape that it got, and what happened in Latin America, why in the 19th century we drafted, or crafted this framework that we still have, characterizing our Constitution. So I will basically stop here. Thank you.